This space, YouTube, hey, hi, thanks for watching here, is not a neutral space necessarily. It's controlled by algorithms. It's controlled by what you like, what you don't like, what you engage with, what you don't want to engage with, what you they think you want to see, what you actually want to see. And in all of that milieu, there are Catholics who want to share the faith, who have ideas of how to do that, who really want to be Christ online. But there are things in the way. There are the debates and dialogues and value and all kinds of different things. At the heart of it is my guest this week, Noah Bradon, who himself a Catholic convert, who met people, who watched things, who read things, who became convinced of the veracity of the church and became Catholic out of a very devout Protestant background and wants to help us to evangelize well. How do we live in this online space as Catholics? How do we share the hope that we have, like the Bible tells us to do, in a way that is going to attract conversation, build relationships, avoid one-off knee-jerk reactions and unnecessary debates, and be Christ online? It's a fascinating conversation. I do hope you watch this and engage with this. There's lots in here to mine and to understand. I hope you enjoy. Noah Bradon, helping us live out our vocation as evangelizers online. Hey friends, welcome to the show. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you are watching on YouTube, thank you. Please subscribe to our channel. Join us in the comments. Hit the bell so you're notified when new videos come out. And thank you for watching. We're happy to have you here. If you're listening on podcasts, hey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, make sure you follow the show, leave some reviews, add some comments on the episodes as well on Spotify and coming soon on Apple Podcasts. That'd be amazing. We're going to have a great conversation today. I am joined by Noah Bradon. He is the Director of Marketing at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. Responsible for spearheading marketing and communications across the Institute. That's awesome. He has a Master's of Arts in Theology and a Bachelor in English, and he's worked a number of years in founding some startups in that kind of work, and is happy to dive into the nonprofit sector and into work like he's doing for the Church Life Institute. He is a co-founder of the Cross the Tiber, also an awesome organization, and lives in South Bend with his wife, children, and their dog. A dog guy. Always good people. Dog people. Noah, thank you for being here.
I knew I liked you for some reason, Pete.
Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm sorry to interrupt your little spiel. Maybe that was a good kind of natural intro, So it was not a rehearsed interruption. It was just a rude interruption on my part, for the listener's sake.
Oh, that's fantastic. At least you know why you like me. That's the one thing, is the dog. That's just right away. We'll be clear. He's got a dog. That's why.
Well, at least that, right? We at least have that, but
we do. Yeah, dog people are great people, and South Bend is wonderful. The Church Life Institute is fantastic. In fact, the university organization is great. I'm very happy that you're there doing that work. That's awesome. And you're a convert to the Catholic faith. Now, when I get guests on this show like yourself, talk about anything, and we'll dig into, I don't know, the main event, the idea of evangelization and online evangelization and how we share the faith and interact online, those kinds of things. That'll be the main course. But when I get a convert on the show like yourself, I always love to give listeners, a bit of flavor. Are we on the culinary theme here? I'm not sure. But we'll a bit of flavor of your story, like where you came from, where your journey began, your reasons for yourself to cross the Tiber. So, if you don't mind, give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch of your faith journey. Start wherever you want to start, and kind of unpack. What led you to make this decision that now you kind of work to help others to make. So, how did it happen for you, Noah?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to dive into that. And thank you again for having me. I'm happy to be here. And talking about my conversion story is something that I've been asked to do quite a few times now, and I try to always approach it a little bit differently. So for better or worse, I never say it the same way. So, you might get a great version or a not so coherent version, but hopefully this is one of the better ones. But In any case, I guess I can give you the overview, and then if you want to dive into any of
Yeah,
the
sure.
particulars, I'm happy to do that. But I grew up in a devout Protestant household. So my grandfather was a Reformed Presbyterian minister. My father was an elder in the PCA. So I grew up very much steeped in Reformed theology with a 5-point Calvinist bent.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and it was not a nominal pursuit for my family. It was sincere. So grew up studying scripture, going to Sunday school, the whole 9 yards. And my mom taught at a small private Christian school, classical Christian school, and I studied theology there, again from a very Calvinist angle. But it was interesting because during that time, somewhat of a traditional leaning Anglican group of people at the school started to increase in number, and I was exposed first. I was first exposed to traditional liturgy through high church Anglicanism, sort of Anglo-Catholicism, if you
Yeah,
will,
yeah, yeah.
late in high school. And as an undergrad, I actually started at Notre Dame. So I went there as a very Catholic-friendly Protestant at the time, still not actually knowing personally many Roman Catholics at all.
Yeah.
Sort of had a couple family friends that I sort of knew of, but didn't know personally. And it was there at Notre Dame that I first started to encounter Catholicism properly explained. Some of those encounters happened through friends, a seminarian friend that was in the same dorm as me that I got to have many great long conversations with, mainly clearing up misconceptions that I previously had held about Catholicism, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's often the first step. I've described it in a couple different ways, but a very accurate way to describe my conversion is having a series of misconceptions cleared up.
Yes, yes, yes.
And especially true at the beginning of my conversion. Later on, I think it was a little bit more of a positive pursuit, trying to seek out answers to particular questions. But early on, it was having misconceptions cleared up. And the first one for me particularly was the intercession of saints. So I had the classic misconception of you're deifying saints by praying to them. Only God can hear our prayers. The classic refrain that I'm sure that we hear and encounter so much online still. And while I know for many it is insufficient, for me, simply hearing the Catholic doctrine properly explained and the logic of it spelled out for me
Yeah, yeah.
was enough to at least make me reconsider what I believed about that doctrine. So it wasn't that I encountered Catholic teaching about intercession of saints. I was like, oh yes, I instantly believe that, and started asking the saints to intercede for me. But it was rather that I saw that it wasn't this wild heretical belief that was
Yeah, yeah,
trying
yeah.
to take away uh, glory due only to God, trying to distract from proper worship, which was always how it was framed in my mind. So I know I'm harping on that one particular, but I think it's emblematic of many of those other dominoes that fell later on. And this conversion process for me happened in bursts. So I think that early on in my undergrad years, through my encounters at Notre Dame, those were certainly some of those the early bursts, if you will, in terms of making progress toward the church, I guess, making progress across the Tiber. Even if I didn't know it, there was no conscious journeying at that point. But somewhere during undergrad, it's interesting to say this because I know that I'm talking positively about my encounter with Catholicism so far, but at the same time, I was growing increasingly disillusioned with religion, with faith, and to some extent, my encounters with Catholicism at Notre Dame gave me some hope for religion because it was first there that I started to encounter faith and reason being equally considered,
Yeah,
sort of
yeah, yeah,
upheld
yeah.
and kind of put side by side, not viewed as contradictory elements that were constantly in combat, but rather complementary means of acquiring truth. That was profound realization for me. Even though it didn't make me want to be Catholic then, it did make me respect Catholics. But I wasn't Catholic, right? So meanwhile, I was having this almost simultaneous parallel disillusionment journey, kind of a deconstruction of my own
Yeah.
faith, right? But so I'm saying this, we have the luxury of hindsight right now, right? Looking back 15, 18, goodness, I don't know, I'm 35, whatever, I'm bad at math, whatever, however many years ago this was, right? To when I'm 18, we have the luxury of hindsight. I certainly wasn't thinking about it that way at the time. But Goodness. So seeds were being planted, positive seeds for Catholicism, while I was also becoming disenchanted with
Yeah,
the
yeah.
faith, or at least the expression of faith as it was conveyed to me as a child. And that was largely because of the rejection of science that I was encountering so often um, in the congregation that I grew up with. There was very much this: if new science came out, if new evidence came out that seemingly contradicted a currently held interpretation of scripture, the evidence was automatically rejected. Like, there was
Right. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
let's try to see if we can sort of approach these two things and kind of like lay them out and kind of like reconcile the two. There was no attempt of that. It was just an open rejection because of its perceived contradiction with interpretation of scripture. And that was something that I think even then, I wouldn't have described it as such. I wouldn't have thought about it philosophically, but I think the epistemology behind that, like, just was something that I struggled with, even then. That's
Yeah.
like, that's
Yeah.
surely that's not, how we come to know things. And so the disillusionment kind of kicked in, and for most of my early 20s, I was largely non-religious, sort of spiritual but not religious. Maybe some form of Christian. What is it? Christian moral
Yeah.
therapeutic
Yeah.
theism. What am I trying to say? It's late, right? But moral therapeutic theism. You know what I'm
Yeah.
talking about,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah. Yeah.
concept. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, what is it called? Can you? It's going to make me crazy if I can't remember.
Therapeutic moralistic deism? I don't
It
know. We gotta
sounds right
ask
to
Christian
me, but
Smith.
clearly I'm not the one to
Yeah.
ask. Well, anyways, I adopted some sort of flimsy
Yeah.
shell
Yeah.
of the Christianity that I was raised with, right? I'd sort of rejected some things, clung to others, and pursued, really, in many senses, replaced the Christianity of my youth with a self-centered hedonism. I mean, again, wouldn't have described it as such at the time, but very much an existentialist kind of view of, let me try to embrace life to its fullest by living life to its fullest through experiences. And unfortunately, the nature of concupiscence is such that when we do those things, it typically leads us towards sin, right? Or at
Yeah.
least points
Yeah.
us to indulge in things of the passions. Um, so, in any case, kind of had this self-centered, hedonistic, flimsy Christian-esque theology at the time, but was largely non-religious for the most of my 20s. And I didn't have this profound reversion, but I was always wrestling, I think, during this whole time, wrestling, not really content with the answers. I was never this strong atheist. I was always kind of in the middle. I was always theistic, but had lots of doubts, and was very much just kind of in that space for a long time. And, at some point, knew that I wanted more, but wasn't quite sure where to find it. And that actually led me back to the church that I grew up in, somewhat interestingly enough.
Yeah.
Even then,
Yeah.
I would have described myself then. That would have been, at the time, I would have self-described as a sort of conscientious objector. Even then, I wasn't very reformed at the time. I didn't really like the Reformation. I was very much against all of the disunity. That was something that deeply troubled me as a Protestant, the lack of unity. I
Yeah.
think even when I was a Protestant, this is true. So this is not just Catholic convert Noah kind of looking at
Yeah.
Protestantism. This
Yeah.
was me 10 years before my conversion being like, come on, this can't be how it's supposed to be. Now, it took a couple more steps to get to
Yeah.
Catholicism
Yeah. Yeah.
as the answer. But in any case, started to seek out the questions, or seek out answers to my questions more fervently, I guess. So at least that was a shift, in the sense that I started to be more intentional, I think, about seeking out answers. And well, you know what? I probably misspoke there. Maybe I'll scrap that last line and just say that I went back to the church that I grew up in, knowing that I needed more, but not quite sure where to find it. Right. But at that point, I was still rather content to not have answers to my questions. So I knew that I needed more for
yeah.
life, but I was I'm sort of resting in the ambiguity.
Yeah.
I was sort of resting in, I don't have answers. I don't know. I have all these questions. But I was more okay with it at that point. And so I think that's how I was able to be, a conscientious objector, so to speak, not really knowing what I was, what type of Christian, what denomination I fit into. I would sort of defend Catholics, but I wasn't Catholic. I was very sort of low church Protestant, at least in my ecclesiology at that point. And anyways, so I think that all changed for me, that being my contentment, where my being content with not knowing all changed when my wife and I decided that we wanted to have kids. So during this time, I met my wife at the church that I grew up in, got married. She and I were very similar in the sense that we kind of shared a lot of our doubts and concerns. And in no sense were we thinking that we were going to become Catholic. That wasn't even on the table. But we started to really get serious about trying to find answers to the questions when we started wanting to have kids. And not having answers when it was just the two of us was one thing, but it's hard to raise your children on we don't know. And I'm not saying that like you don't want to have some intellectual humility and let them know when you don't know, honestly, but we were just quite content to not know and not care about a lot. And that shifted radically when we started having children. So I dove back into my studies in many senses, started to revisit theology, started to poke and prod at assumptions that I had. And somewhere along that way, I had a serendipitous encounter, providential encounter with someone who's now become a dear friend. He ended up being my sponsor. He's my daughter's godfather. And it was someone that I thought was a business lead. We got sat next to each other at a fundraiser breakfast by a mutual friend who thought we'd get along. I at the time, was running my own agency, trying to sell, honestly, trying to get him to be a client of mine. And we hit it off, went out to lunch, and he ended up praying over the meal very much, in classic Catholic fashion, asked if he could beforehand. And that prompted a series of religious conversations. And we spent the entire lunch talking about his conversion. So he was a convert, and he started sharing his journey. And no lie, Keith, that set off. For several of the weeks, it was probably 5-6 hours a week. We were on the phone just wrestling through. This was during the heart of COVID too. So we lived close to each other. So, but it was still very much like in the heavily restricted time. So we just spent hours and hours and hours every week. And we're both busy guys with families. I don't know how he made the time, honestly, clearly doing it in sort of a ministerial, apostolate kind of sense. And that set off, I guess, the final phase of it, which is when I dove headfirst into all of it, seriously wrestled with all of my lingering questions. And it didn't start with, is Catholicism true? It kind of started with, what do I believe? What's the most likely to believe? And it ended up kind of getting me to the conclusion that Catholicism, contains or is representative of the fullness of Christian truth. So that concept was very impactful on me, that being the fullness of truth versus exclusive access to truth. I think that was sort of a big pivotal kind of breakthrough moment for me at some point as a Protestant. But in any case, I don't know if that kind of tied it all together, but that leads us kind of to that last part where this guy, my friend, and I were wrestling through these things for months together. This lasted for 4 or 5 months. And somewhere around that point, he asked if he could introduce me to a priest friend of his. And at that point, it was a Thomist priest, one of the smartest men I know, was willing to go into depths of nuance that no one really has any business even knowing exists. That kind of brilliant mind that sees layers that you're not even aware of. And but it was good. It was what I needed, right? It was the person that could take me over the last of my hurdles, the one who could really dive in with me, kind of wrestle about apostolic authority, the Marian devotions. How do we all think about this? How does it all play out? And about a year after I met this friend, about 6 months after started talking with the priest, I entered what amounted to about a 9-month virtual
Yes, yeah,
catechesis
yeah,
class
yeah.
with this Thomist priest, with the blessing of our local diocese, because it was during the time where they had no RCIA, like everything
Yeah,
had
yeah,
just
yeah,
shut
yeah.
down, so everyone was scrambling. Um, so I had this very peculiar situation, but it was everyone was happy that the priest was willing to do this. So it was kind of like everyone was just pleased that it was happening at all, and then became Catholic 3.5 years ago on the feast day of Saint Nicholas.
Wow.
Was confirmed Catholic, yeah, at that point, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's an amazing story. I love that story, and I love that. I mean, we're talking about relational apologetics, evangelization, like online, in person, how we do this and do this better and do this well and fail miserably at doing this, and I love how your story. I don't often encounter a story quite like yours that you really it was that chance kind of encounter that relationship that really solidified your deepening interest and then eventual conversion to Catholicism. The work that I do here is obviously online. I get all kinds of emails from people, questions, and write back to those, and people are listening to this and the stories that we bring. That's very different than encountering a person across a table who prays, and you go, "Oh, hey, why are you praying there?" I love how your journey is like that. My mine was the opposite of your journey, maybe. Like I became Catholic through a lot of reading and a lot of studying. I ended up consuming hours and hours of the journey home on YouTube, which was kind of a new thing at the time. YouTube. I did like 2 years of RCIA through Our Lady of Good Counsel Parish in Plymouth, Michigan. Father John Ricardo. They filmed all their RCIA on like a handy cam, right, and then put it up online. And I watched that. It was like the 2 years worth of this. It must have been like dozens of hours. It was, I think, every hour session was like 4 hours long. It was a marathon. And then the only Catholic I knew in person at that time, Noah, was a good friend of mine who was a terrible Catholic. He was like the guy that you'd see, at the bar drinking his face off, stumble home, get up for mass the next day, make it halfway through, then go home and he was a great guy and I love him. And he piqued my interest and brought me to my very first mass, noonday mass on campus where we were studying, which was amazing. But for all intents and purposes, this guy was not a great Catholic, and that was the one Catholic that I knew at the time. I don't think I even went to mass until I began RCIA. I don't think, if I'm
Oh,
remembering
wow.
correctly. Like I was convinced of Catholicism through just mostly online encounters and reading and studying, piles of books and hours of YouTube. I think honestly, my first mass and met my first Catholics after I'd already kind of made that leap and said, "Yeah, I want to become Catholic." So, kind of the polar opposite of of your journey,
That's
right?
so fascinating, yeah.
And your work, across the Tiber, your work, your research for your masters, like the work you're doing for the institute, kind of I think bridges both of those kind of worlds, right? Those two extremes, right? It's fascinating that your story is kind of the opposite of mine.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think that there's probably some both, comparisons and contrast there, because to be sure I was reading a lot in between
Yeah,
these
yeah,
encounters, right?
yeah,
But they really were those were the relationships were the catalysts that sparked the research for me. So I did have the times where I was diving into books, and
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
had
You
a
can
handful of
read. Yeah,
books
I didn't
that
think you could. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
yeah, like,
I
I
didn't
did
think you
read one
could.
or
Yeah,
two
and I
books,
feel
I
I
did,
feel bad now.
but
Thinking you. Yeah.
no, 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 please. I didn't take it badly. I just think I was reflecting on it a little bit more. And it certainly wasn't that I was convinced, so to speak, during the conversations. It was almost that the
Sure.
conversations would
Yeah.
inspire me to go revisit. And then I would dig in and do the reading. And then I'd come back with more questions. And then I'd
Yeah.
have kind of
Yeah.
wrestled
Yeah.
through those and then dive back in. So it was this iterative process. And to be honest with you, that's one of the motivations. That's one of the particular reasons that I helped found Across the Tiber, because effectively what we do at Across the Tiber is try to provide a virtual community for people who do not have those relationships, who do not have access to the relationships that I had, right? So I was in this interesting situation where I had the real life encounter, but then it was also during COVID. So I had Zoom classes with a priest who was doing this, right? So there was a digital, a new media component even then out of necessity. But it started really getting me thinking, right? Well, how do we start to recreate this sense of community for people who don't have a friend who's willing to take them out to dinner, who's willing to have phone calls with them for hours? That's a big ask, right? I mean, I don't have hours a week to talk to people. It's exhausting. It's hard. And I don't mean that insultingly. It's just, it's hard. You know, you're busy. It's exhausting.
Yes.
It really is. So I was so touched by the relationship, you know, the relational side of it. And yet I was also benefiting from these virtual media, you know, these digital media, these virtual communities. And that in no small part inspired our desire to launch Cross the Tiber as a platform. Because I think a lot of people are maybe more in your shoes, Keith, where they're interested and they're reading and they're exploring, you know, they're watching videos on YouTube and they have all these questions, but they don't have a person that they can text and be like, hey, buddy, do you have a few minutes to hop on the phone? Because I did that, and that was life-changing for me, and it accelerated my conversion. At the very least, right? Like, I mean, by God's grace, I'm sure if he wanted me to become Catholic, you know, he would have paved the way for me to become Catholic one way or another. But he certainly used people, used relationships, used friendships to accelerate that. So I say all this kind of while also recognizing that virtual communities are not sufficient, right? So we're not looking to replace the ground level parish offerings. You know, we're not looking to supplant RCIA or OCIA or whatever whatever we're supposed to call it now. We're not in any means trying to take the place of the parishes, but we recognize that parishes are oftentimes stretched too thin. They're oftentimes ill-equipped to meet the needs of people that are spread across, you know, sometimes very large areas. And then also sometimes people are not comfortable enough where they are in their journey to take the step to actually go into a parish and talk to a priest. Because for some people, that might be a comforting thing to actually talk to someone personally. But for many people, that might be really, really intimidating. So having a comfort zone is sort of a half step, you know, in between is something that seems to be working out really well. And we've had, we've been around for about three years and change now, and we've had over 1,000 people sign up in some capacity, a mixed group of Catholics and non-Catholics. We currently have somewhere close to 300 active participants, over 300 if you include the volunteers. And it's all volunteer run. So it's a nonprofit. No one takes salaries. It's all volunteer run and largely by converts who are looking to give back in some capacity. So the idea is simply to facilitate conversations with well-catechized Catholics who are actually willing to walk alongside you with your particular angle of approach for your questions, right? Because we'll get similar questions many times over, but everyone approaches it, you know, with their particular context in mind. You know, if they're Presbyterian, they're going to be coming at it from a very particular angle, right? If they're Anglican, a very different angle. If they're atheist or you know, some sort of into some pagan spirituality, you know, they're going to have a very different angle again. So we don't do it perfectly, but we also try to pair people with people who can relate to them. So insofar as we have volunteers with similar backgrounds, we make an effort to facilitate conversations with people who can relate, so we can dive in. And it's not combative. We don't entertain debates. We're very clear about that. So when people start getting combative in debate, we just kind of remind them that that's not what we're here for. You know, we answer questions, but not just in a Catholic answers sense where you get a clear answer. And we're very good answer. I'm not looking to, not throwing shade at Catholic Answers. I love them. We're trying to provide this in between where, there's great resources like Catholic Answers, right? But there still needs to be a relationship to facilitate, or at least to help kind of accelerate that process, or at least we see great benefit in doing that. So, we always try to point people back to their actual sources, primary sources if possible, the catechism, scripture, church documents. We try to stay there as much as possible. We do occasionally bring in secondary stuff. We have some YouTube channels that we'll bring in, but we try to be very this is what Orthodox Catholicism is properly explained. We try not to editorialize it. We don't really engage in the liturgy wars in our groups and those types of things, but we certainly get questions about them. So it's almost like I hate the word in a sense because it's a loaded term, but it's almost like a safe space to ask questions. And I mean that in the best possible sense. It's a non-judgmental space. You can do it anonymously. I mean, you do have to sign up with your name, but that can be kept private. So we have pastors who are currently Protestant pastors in there with us, who obviously we keep all of their information private because they would risk their jobs potentially. So it's been such a blessing, though. So that's what led me to found Cross the Tiber, and that's what led me in many ways to continue by joining the McGrath Institute for Church Life, because it really is the synthesis of what I just described about my motivation for Cross the Tiber and my own conversion story at a much bigger scale. Synthesizing that with my professional background in communications and marketing. So, now doing that for the church, at the McGrath Institute, with the support of Notre Dame, is really the culmination of all of what we've been talking about tonight, both my conversion and Cross the Tiber and all of it. So I don't know if I don't even know what the question was, but hopefully that answered something.
It's a fantastic answer. And I think it's so true. And the funny thing is I get all kinds of emails and I love them. I love the feedback. It's nice to hear people are out there listening. It's always encouraging because it feels like I'm talking into a void sometimes. But I get the emails where people feel like they know me and my story so well because they listen to the podcast and they have for maybe many years or many months, and they've heard episodes, they've heard parts of my story, and they'll email me, and I love that. But the weird thing is they'll go, I feel like I know you so well because here, but I don't know them at all. And it's this funny kind of one-way relationship where I can share a lot, but I don't know who they are or where they're listening from or anything about them, but they feel there's a kind of that connection there, which I love, and it's awesome because that relational thing is so important, but it's also not really real sometimes because I don't know them like they know me. Right? I've not listened to them for the last number of years or months and heard all about their story, but that thirst, that need for that connection, like you're talking about, that relational connection is there. Right. That's why somebody listens and goes, I know this guy. I'm going to reach out to the one Catholic that I kind of know. So I listened to him for a while and, let's connect and here's some questions I have. But it's not necessarily, and I'm not, this sounds terrible. I'm disparaging listeners who email me. What I'm trying to say is, what you're doing in that relational kind of building of questions people have is what so many people are looking for. Right, in the digital world, right, looking for that connection. They have these questions, right? Maybe, like you're saying, they're in a place where they can't ask those. They don't know any Catholics. I didn't know any Catholics. They can't very easily just go up and just call a parish or call a priest and ask these questions. I think there's great resources out there, right? And the heart of Catholic Answers is that Catholic Answers live call-in show, but it's hard to get on there. Like it's hard, right? For one thing, it's hard. What do you say? Oh dear, I have to go make a phone call, wait in the phone for an hour while to somebody. I can't tell you more information than that because without revealing that I'm becoming Catholic or thinking about it, right? So all that to say, like the importance of that relational aspect, right? At some point in that journey, that becomes so important, whether it's at the beginning, whether it's at the end, in the middle, to ask those questions of somebody. I think that's so important because I'm thinking about, like, the question about Mary, for example, right? There's so many ways you can ask questions about Mary, and there's lots of resources that answer those questions, but there's always those kind of nuances, right? I experimented for a bit putting out some reels on Instagram and got all kinds of great traffic, and my intention, Noah, was to model how I thought online apologetics should be done, evangelization should be done, but by carefully answering questions, by charitably responding, by really trying to get to the root of the question being asked. And I had fun doing it. I'm going to get back into it when summer's over and I have a bit more free time, back into a regular rhythm and routine. And I loved it. But what I found is there were so many different approaches to those questions. I put a video out about Mary, being mother of the church, for example. And I would get so many different kinds of responses, people from different kinds of backgrounds with little nuances to their question, that I realized, wow, there's so many people who have weird versions of these questions, right? You can kind of open the door in one reel or one article or one video, but there's all that follow-up to do with people who have deeper questions, right? Where that personal aspect has to come in, or you're throwing a ball, you're lobbing a softball, and it lands, but you pick it up, and where does it go from there, right? If there's not that relational, that chance to kind of have that follow-up. Does that make sense?
I think it really does. Yeah, because you won't. I feel like so many times you probably encounter this when you're online, right? When people are talking past each other, someone makes this great, profound point, and they think clearly that was a death blow to the other side. Like, why can't they just see it? And the other person is just completely, unfazed by it. Just doesn't see any strength in the argument. And I think that. Oh goodness, I lost how I was going to connect it back. What did you just prompt? What was the prompt there?
I forget.
Oh man, sorry. This is the problem with the late. Like, I know it's not actually that late, but
yeah, it's late. It's we have kids.
I am in
it's
focus,
late enough.
right?
Yeah.
Am I in focus?
Yeah, you look great.
Okay, I just want to say it's a small screen. I'm using my phone because. But
you look fantastic.
Okay, cool, awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah, it looks wonderful.
Just what I'm saying, because if I'm not in focus, I won't be able to tell. It's like it's all kind of like in a small little.
No. It looks good.
What was the thing? I feel like there was a good point though that we were going to make though. I think we were. You were talking about. Oh yeah, because. So yeah, with what I guess I just said about people talking past each other, I think you can connect. You can probably blip out with all that and go back. So I think the relational aspect is in many senses what helps prevent, and it's almost in many senses the solution to that problem, which is talking past each other and which is not having statements or arguments really hit home. I feel like the relational component really binds it all together. It's maybe those little half steps. I mean, to continue your sports analogy, maybe it's not a big throw, maybe it's just a little handoff or something, maybe it's just like a small progress, but it's progress just the same. And it gets the person into a position, I've found oftentimes, where they actually can make significant progress. And that certainly happened with me, right? Where certain relationships were catalysts that helped propel, a major amounts of progress, toward the truth. But I wouldn't have been in the right position in order to be there without that relational assist kind of pushing me there. So, yeah, I think that was the point you're making, or at least that was the takeaway I got. And I think that all makes sense.
Yeah, and it's very different, right, to see a video online and to have that knee-jerk response to it and go, oh, they're wrong, here's why, versus you know a guy who's Catholic who believes this and lives it out, and, oh, that looks weird, I think he's wrong, right? That's a very different approach in those two situations. Like, first of all, you're not going to go up to your friend and knee jerk them with a response like you have that relationship, but you're actually watching that person live that thing out, or you know of that person and you see their life, right? That's a very different kind of situation, right?
Very much. Very
Yeah.
much.
And very much a product of our modern, the internet, right? And social media, that we have those kind of one-off videos and those chance to have that knee-jerk kind of reaction, right? I think, pre-social media, pre-Reels and TikTok and Instagram and these kinds of things, pre-YouTube, you would know a guy who's Catholic and maybe object to his theology because you're Presbyterian, but you'd have, if you wanted to challenge him or encounter him, you got to go meet him and talk to him and introduce yourself, right? Or be a wacky street preacher, just yell things at him as he walks by. But in most cases, right, it's that relationship is going to precede those discussions, right? Well, now we're stripping that away in many cases, and the first encounter maybe a lot of people are going to have with other ideas to their the theology that they're steeped in or raised in or going through is the algorithm on say TikTok choosing, hey, they might like this video, and then hey, it's me spouting off the idea of the early church, right, being in the Catholic Church, and their response is, wait a minute, like what, right? Because we can no longer control those sometimes first interactions, right? Which
Absolutely.
that's interesting too.
Yeah, that is an interesting thought. The first interactions are often happening in this disembodied state, right? Not in this in sort of this discarnate environment, right? The digital environment, which almost in some sense puts us at a disadvantage as Christians trying to evangelize, right? Because one of the inherent points of tension in digital evangelization is the fact that we're believers in an incarnational religion, right? We're trying to point people to incarnational truth, and yet we're using digital discarnate means in order to do that. And that's a concept that Marshall and also his son Eric McLuhan. I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
They're Canadian. Come on, of course.
Yeah. Okay, you are. Okay, good. Well, I just feel like I either get blank stares or people are like, yeah, like McLuhan's the best.
He's on a stamp we have up here in Canada, I think.
But they talk a lot about that. It's kind of like there's that tension between that. How do we navigate that, and how do we navigate the fact that, as McLuhan talks about, the medium being the message, his famous line, the medium is the message. And whether you agree with it or not, I think that it's indisputable that we are in a digital environment that is far more than a collection of digital media, right? We've entered something altogether new. We're not merely using digital media, but we are in many ways entering into a digital environment. So the means of engagement, the way we're interacting, even what you, I think, very astutely identified as that initial contact point or whatever it is happening in this very disconnected, ironically disconnected, right? We're connected online, but it's sort of in this disconnected, impersonal sense. So how is that filtering people's perception of the message that they're hearing? We don't quite know, and that's another one of the challenges, right? So we're also using tools that are absolutely impacting us, right? And there's many studies that are suggesting, detrimental impact on youth in particular, but not exclusively youth. Social media use is rampant among adults. I think it's somewhere in the 60-70% of adults use it with great frequency, and that's including YouTube and Facebook, right? Kind of the in aggregate, but the mental health, I don't want to use the word crisis lightly, but it seems to be that social media and the use of the internet is at least a major contributing factor to the mental health crisis that youth are experiencing. I think that's a fair statement. At least many people would agree with it. Yeah. And yet, I'm not suggesting that we disconnect, right? The church has advocated very clearly that disengagement, in a sense, is not an option, right? Like the battlefront, the evangelization battlefront very much is in the digital world. So we're in this peculiar position as modern Christians where we have to engage. I think within reason, we have to use all virtuous means at our disposal. And and yet we're using means that we know have detrimental impacts, and we don't yet know the full extent. Of which we don't yet know the full extent. So it's this interesting situation where we're kind of in this game of perpetual catch up, where even the information that we're getting about the digital world is like there's a lag in a sense, right? Like, we're getting the information, but it's too late because by that point, we're 10 years down the road and we're just now understanding how 10 years ago the technology is affecting us now, barely. And it's like, but how's the technology that we're using now, like literally today, going to affect us in 20 years? We have no idea. Or we have only a little bit of an idea. And I'm not a doomsday person. So I know I'm now probably sounding a little more apocalyptic than I mean to. I'm actually rather optimistic about it. I certainly have benefited from the use of digital media. But I do think it is appropriate to, what is the word? Not regulate, when you tweak, dial, calibrate. Yeah. So I think it is important to have a proper calibration of the danger. Like I'm not trying to say that this is, the sky's falling, get offline, everything online is bad. I don't think that's true. But I think that the reaction to that is all rainbows and butterflies. It's great. Like, let's just use it. Let's just embrace it and not think about the danger is equally foolhardy. I think that, the way forward for Catholics, as is often the case, right, lies obnoxiously in the middle. So we have to rest in that tension, between the use of new media and the sharing of timeless truths, right? So we're using new media to share timeless truths. So it's this interesting thing because in many senses, we're almost in a novel playing field as evangelists. So I don't know where that leaves us, but I think it's important at least to have this proper sense of it. It's not all bad to be shunned and avoided. Stick our heads in the sand is certainly not something I think that's good. And yet I think it's also dangerous for us to just embrace it without thought for the very real and potential dangers, both to us and the people that we're ministering to. I think that's an interesting, way to look at it, as well as to the message that we're conveying from us to the people. And so I don't know. So I have a lot more questions than answers, unfortunately, for your listeners here. But I think these are important questions to be asking. And I think that we Catholics, whether we're involved in this stuff directly like I am, this is something that I think about a lot through my research that I just completed at Notre Dame, as well as through my work at the McGrath Institute. I very much am resting at the intersection of theology and communication and trying my best to articulate and then hopefully by God's grace, embody an incarnational theology of communication for the digital age. And it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I don't know where it's going to take me exactly. But I think that there are some marks or identifying factors that are worth mentioning, at least that have kind of helped me think about this. How do we articulate an incarnational theology of communication for the digital age? And I think that a lot of my research has leaned heavily on Ratzinger, on Pope Benedict the 16th, especially Introduction to Christianity, which I think is a really important Christocentric reference, basically for almost how to deconstruct and reconstruct the faith, and in a very evangelistic kind of bent. And I think it's a very valuable thing for many of us, because I think that we have to, in many senses, deconstruct. I know that's a dangerous word, and then sort of carefully reconstruct in the sense that we're using novel means to share these ancient truths, and we're talking to a modern audience that isn't going to respond the same way that an audience did 100 years ago. So there needs to be this sort of the kind of never changing, ever new, or whatever the phrase is. I don't know. That might be a misquote, but there we go. I'm either misquoting someone or stealing someone's words or something there. So you can kind of do what you will with the edit there, but. It does. So anyways, back to those marks. Maybe it'd be helpful to do this. So I think what I encountered during my research as I was trying to articulate an incarnational theology of communication were 5 primary marks or identifying factors that help us articulate this way of using digital media for evangelization purposes. And the first one, I think, as is the case with all evangelizations, I think it needs to be grounded in the Trinity. I think there's a Trinitarian component to the entire faith, right? I mean, that is in so many ways the source of our faith. The Catechism says as much, everything with respect to theology is in some ways a reflection, kind of pointing back to the Trinity. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on this concept of Trinitarian communication, because in many senses, God, the triune God, is in a state of perpetual communication, sort of this internal, mystical kind of defies all human expectation. But communication is, in a sense, essential to God's identity. This sort of this state, being in a state of communication, even, and then to build upon that even more, God creates through communication, right? I mean, He spoke the world into creation, into existence, right? There's this integral and this essential relationship between communication and identity, being, existence, creation. These really fundamental realities, right? And I think a lot of that really does stem back, as Catholics, I think we have to believe that is grounded in the Trinity and Trinitarian communication, if you will, if that's not too much of a stretch to use. And then going to Ratzinger, especially to Introduction to Christianity, Pope Benedict's beautiful exposition of the Christian faith, where I think that he modeled what I like to think of as a Christocentric reconstruction of the faith, where he was trying to represent the Christian faith to his then contemporary audience. And I think he did that in a way by breaking it down to its essential components and then almost rethinking how to represent them, if you will, right? The same truths, not changed, and yet represented to keep in, to keep in mind his particular context, his particular audience. So I think that's another thing that we can really use as a model, as a marker for our own pursuit. So we have kind of Trinitarian, Christocentric, and then another one that kept becoming more and more clear to me during research was the sacramental element of communication, right? I mean, God has created an existence, a reality, a cosmos, to use Louis Bouillet's terminology, that is sacramental, this sort of meta-sacramentality that binds all of existence together, right? It's in some sense why the sacraments matter and why those resonate with us so much is because the world and existence and very being is sacramental in a sense. There's this sacramentality that extends beyond the particulars. And I think also, though, zooming in on the particulars, those are, those being the sacraments themselves, the holy sacraments are a profound means of communication that God uses to communicate with us. So I think you have this kind of, dual sense, both in terms of, God has instilled sacramentality into existence, as part of, the very nature of our life, and our interaction with the world, but then he also communicates to us through the sacraments, right? And I think actually the sacrament of holy matrimony is a particularly, the Eucharist is a beautiful example, and much could be said about the Eucharist as a means of communication. But I think that holy matrimony is something that I think is a deeply profound example of sacramental communication, because it not only is an example of how God communicates to us, but also how we can become cooperators in God's plan for creation, right? So in a profound sense, God communicates through the sacraments, and then we, as participants in holy matrimony, become collaborators in creation through a type of communication, a communication of love, the self-gift of love that happens through marriage and through the procreative act. So I think that, and then building upon that with the sacramental, it kind of brings us back to the relational, right? We've talked a lot about this at the beginning of my conversion, apologetics, relational apologetics with respect to Cross the Tiber. But that's really something that continues to rise to the top anytime I'm researching, thinking about the theology of communication is that relational component, right? It's a relational religion. Catholicism is. It's spread through relationship, and I think that that's an important component that cannot be, that can just not be underestimated. So does that make sense though, Keith? As like a framework, it doesn't give us an answer, right? These marks don't give us this clear cut solution. It's not a formula, but it's more of a framework for approaching our use of digital media as evangelists.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much in there. I mean, I think the idea of, you realize in a sense, I mean, for me, I became Catholic 2015, 2014. And when COVID hit and the churches were closed, and I was the guy leading RCIA online with my group of people on Zoom, you realize quite quickly how many of those things that you took for granted in how you evangelize and share the faith, aren't compatible, or aren't the same thing when you suddenly aren't face to face, when you suddenly can't go and receive the sacraments in a very sacramental faith because the churches are closed for that period of time, right? All those things suddenly really come into sharp focus, right? And those, of course, when lockdowns ended and we went back to regular life, right? You kind of forget how it felt back then when those things weren't accessible. But, right, those things still don't exist in the same way online as they do in person, right? We still don't have access. There never was a possibility of accessing the sacraments online. There never was a possibility, saved from some kind of matrix situation, of being in person and online at the same time. Like those things, those realities just were in a sharper focus when there wasn't the option of being in person and living that sacramental life, because it was just online. That makes sense. But that didn't change, right? We've added a layer back of being in person and stuff. Thank goodness we weren't quarantined for our whole entire lives, and the planet didn't implode. But digital media is still digital media. Digital evangelization is still the same thing, right? And we've made strides because we had to figure out how to build relationships online, right? How to understand that our faith is sacramental even when we can't. I can't bring a guy I'm talking to online into church for adoration, right? Even though that's a really central part of our faith, but how do you understand and express that? Understand that Christ is incarnate in the, in the in-person faith, but in the online faith too, right? That email I'm running back to at 3 a.m, because that's the one time I have a chance to write back to the email. I mean, Christ is no less present in that situation than if I was, talking to a guy at a coffee shop. Like, Christ wants to be in both those conversations, right? How do we channel that disembodied typing on my phone versus that in-person kind of conversation, right? And I mean, to that I add the layer in my mind of, right, I wouldn't be a Catholic if it weren't for digital evangelization and the new media, right? My very, very first encounter with anybody Catholic or Catholic ideas was actually a podcast that, a priest in Netherlands, Father Roderick Vonnegut, in one of the very first podcasts ever. He was one of the pioneers of podcasts. And I used to have to hook up my phone with a cable to my computer that I powered on in the morning, and had a program that ran that would scrape the internet for these podcasts and download them. Right? It was so old school, right? But he was using the new media, and it was proudly called that back then because it was so new. Right? And I got to know this Catholic priest and realized that priests were real people, and that there were Catholics who took their faith seriously. I never met him in person. We've talked a bunch since, but that is a whole other filter. The people we meet online are real people and real experiences, right? But there's still that thing in between, that right? That's separating us from actually being face to face and in person. Like,
Yeah.
wow. it's I like that you're hopeful because it's challenging. I like that you see a hope in this for the future. I guess you wouldn't have your job probably, or to be doing your job if you didn't have hope for the future
Well, it
of
would have been
these
harder to
things.
sell them on hiring me, I suppose, if I was like, hire me to run your digital media. By the way, digital media, we're all doomed if we
You're all
use it. So,
doomed. Yeah,
yeah, it would have hurt the pitch a little bit. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's a tough thing. I think. I mean, some of the things that come to mind when you're talking about the examples that you just brought up with. Yeah, it's like some of the things that I really think that help me, and this again isn't a solution, it isn't a formula type answer, but I think what it's grounded in, what these interactions are grounded in, what are motivating them, so what's kind of fueling
yeah,
them on
yeah,
our end. I think
yeah,
that's really important, and I think that's something that really resonates with me about what you just shared, right? That email, or that text message or whatever it is you're sending, right? You are really motivated, by this desire to share an incarnational love, so you're using a digital means, but you're kind of motivated incarnationally, if you will, to kind of continue to lean into that language. But then I think also it's not just that; it's sort of grounded in the incarnational, right? And
yeah,
then there's the
yeah.
digital in the middle. But I think it's also oriented toward the incarnational, or at least at its best, it is, right? So you described, and I'm similar. At least a big part of my conversion was videos as well. In between those interactions, like
Yeah,
there were
yeah,
books, but there were also great videos that probably did more than 30 minutes than a book did
yeah,
in 6 hours. Sometimes it's weird to say because I love books. I was an English
yeah, yeah.
major back in the day too. I love books, but I can't deny that. But um, but yeah, I think that the kind of the what it's grounded in, what these interactions are grounded in, and what they're oriented toward, I think is what changes things. I think we start to get into trouble when we start to, create, kind of engage in the digital world, for its own sake, perhaps.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's
yeah,
helpful to be viewed as a tool, and I actually think it's helpful to be relegated to the role of tool. And I think that's sort of a dangerous thing about the digital environment. Excuse me, about digital media. That was the Freudian slip. About the use of digital media is that it brings with it a digital environment, right?
yeah,
That is one of the inherent dangers of its use. But I think that insofar as we're able to, we should try to relegate it and view it and leverage it as a tool, which would be something that has a particular purpose, right? There's a motivation for its use. There's a particular purpose, and
yeah,
it's good. It's you would call its usage good when it's being used properly according to its purpose. So if you are, I think, using digital media and you have a particular purpose, you're trying to convey a particular message to a particular audience. I think in many cases there's no better way to access that audience than use of digital media. I skipped over some of the good stuff, but in the midst of all of the mental health crises, which are real, we have unprecedented access to every corner of the world, and that
yeah,
is huge. I mean, things that early missionaries could only have dreamt about. You imagine Paul, shipwrecked on a rock, being like, if I could send an email. I mean, it's almost like absurd. He's taking a boat, hoping to survive the journey, and we could, you know, drop a shipping container. They do this in the middle of Africa and have wireless internet, through satellites, through
yeah,
shipping containers. Like literally, I mean, every corner of the world has cell phones. Literally, even the
yeah,
poorest corners of the world, people will have cell phones. That's wild. That's just wild. There are very few corners of the world that are not accessible. So in some sense, the Christian has much to celebrate. As Catholics trying to evangelize and share our faith, we have a bigger potential audience than ever before. But certainly that doesn't mean that everything is fair game because we have a big audience, or don't worry about the negatives, right? But I think
yeah,
there is. I think
yeah,
the upside is considerable, largely because of that reach. It's impressive, and I think the potential to extend, to create communities across borders in interesting ways. I think there's also sort of cross cultural collaborative opportunities that the virtual world has opened up that would be a lot harder to facilitate, right? Because of the logistics of going to a place physically. But maybe there's something else that we have to remind ourselves sometimes, that not everything we do digitally, and maybe many things that we do digitally, are not these better replacements for the tangible physical. Like, I think that's also where we kind of get, it's like, oh, I now do that digitally. I mean, maybe some things are. I shop online. I mean, I think there's some things you can make thoughtful decisions, because, I mean, maybe the time that you would be spending in traffic and away from your family, like, maybe it is better spent at home, and that's an appropriate use of the internet. I don't know. I mean, those are decisions that we have to make ourselves, and I think, parse through them.
Yeah.
But I think maybe that's also part of it, right? Just be, even though not many people actually care enough to do it, and many people probably will think you're silly if you mention this to them, but just be thoughtful about your use of digital media. Take a moment to think about, why you do some of the things that you do on digital media. It doesn't mean the answer is always stop doing it. I mean, I think that's where people kind of get, there's always these polarized, extremes, but just be thoughtful about it. Just know what you're doing. And just don't be in a state where you're just reacting to something that you don't have much control on. Because I think one of the interesting dangers that is kind of emerging about social media is its impact on free will. And I have not done much research on this. This is outside of my purview, but I've read some interesting stuff that's starting to come out about this. And just large. I mean, I guess the idea is that algorithms favor engagement, right? So the algorithm doesn't really care why you're engaging. So if you're angry and engaging, if you're sad and you're engaging, if you're, whatever, it doesn't really matter what the emotion is. So the algorithm isn't trying to make you angry per se, but it certainly doesn't mind letting you be angry if that means that you're going to continue to engage. So all it wants is to keep you engaging. So what typically happens is we, through our own behaviors, in combination with the algorithm, effectively start entering an echo chamber of our own making, or at least partially of our own making. So we start being fed the same content that we continue to engage with. So whether it's either positive stuff, we start seeing all the same stuff that we always like, and then we only see stuff that we like, and then we don't know about anything that we don't like, which is dangerous, right? Or we're just angry all the time because we're just reacting to things that make us mad. And, it's this constant war, and you think that everyone around you is like literally out to get you. And this starts getting some really dangerous conspiratorial thinking that can fester. And there's actual real dangers on both sides. So I think, again, it comes down to balance, thoughtfulness, and kind of an intentionality, and just leaning on that framework. And I don't know. Does that make some sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense, right? And it is an intentionality for people who are trying to evangelize online. If you're creating things, if you're trying to engage with people, right? Or you're trying to just win an argument every time, right? There's that big difference, right? And that intentionality of how you're engaging with that, right? Are you just trying to, right? Are what you notice, first of all, maybe that what you're seeing online is fed by, right, an algorithm, and is that echo chamber, right? I don't know how many times I've been caught in that. Wait a minute, I'm seeing all these things that are making me angry because I'm engaging with them, and then I'm seeing more things that are making me angry, right? Because I'm telling Instagram I want to see more things that make me angry, unintentionally, or sometimes intentionally. It feels good to get a little rage out.
Sure, yeah. I'm guilty sometimes.
Yeah, there is that intention, right? It's not just a neutral thing, right? For creators and those who want to engage and evangelize online, right? Because it is that, and it's so much easier just to mindlessly engage or just to want to win that argument versus build that relationship with a person, or ask questions of that person to see where they're coming from, to understand their point of view, right? There's so much wrapped up in that. It's very fascinating. And again, I'm glad that you're hopeful. I'm glad that there are real positive things. I know for me, in becoming Catholic and just deepening my faith, it's amazing to see how connected and global the Catholic Church is, right? You hear about it you hear about how, the one, universal, Catholic Church. You hear that, right? You come to believe that. You might go travel somewhere on vacation and go to mass, and in Spanish, and it's the same. And you're like, wow, this is so cool. Like this is everywhere. But then the ability to connect with actual Catholics everywhere is astounding, right? And the internet powers that, right? So that's a very, very positive thing. I can talk to. I had listened to ones who said, "Yeah, I'm emailing you from like the most remote, tiny island off like the Scottish coast or something like imaginable. It's me and like my goats on this island, and I love your show." I'm like, wow, this is like, that's amazing, right? Or I follow like
and unexpected.
yes. Or I follow like half a dozen different priests across the African continent in different countries because I love this. That's such a different experience of Catholicism and gives me hope for the thriving church, right? In parts of Africa is amazing. But those are really positive, awesome things, right? But there is that intentionality, and there is that tendency, and I don't want to get too kind of, I don't know, I'm charismatic in my background as a Pentecostal. I don't want to get too charismatic, too kind of wacky here, but there is that definite underside to, well, okay, if this is a positive, well then Satan's going to twist it for a negative too, right? And use those negative interactions, right? Use those that our built-in nature to argue and debate and to win that debate, right? Satan's going to use that to try and steer people away from the truth of the Catholic faith, right? And to get into those engagements and make them worse than they could be, right?
Absolutely.
It's dark, it's fascinating, right? But it's definitely a part of like our modern evangelization, I think, right?
I think it is, and I think that I think you brought up a good point there, and it is worth remembering that the spiritual warfare side of this is certainly wrapped up in sorry, I didn't say that very clearly, but to be sure, if we're trying to use digital means to evangelize, we're hopefully engaging in a positive spiritual warfare, right? I mean, we're trying to hopefully help win souls for Christ and point people toward Him. But to be sure, as with any new environment, if you will, any tool, that can be used for good or ill, we're going to see both. And so, and this is maybe one of the reasons why disengagement, if it was complete disengagement by all Christians, it'd be scary because there'd be just kind of completely succumb, I guess, to the sort of the more baser tendencies, online. If there was, all good people, all people of goodwill, all Catholics, all Christians, everyone,
quit the internet.
Just quit the internet because of the bad. Well, it would certainly look a lot worse, that next day, because then there's no good at all, but what does that mean? You certainly can't then participate in the bad just because it's there. So then there's that tension between avoiding participation in the bad, and that's where moral theology gets so complicated, right? It's like you know that there's potential bad, you can't participate in it, but being in the situation doesn't inevitably lead to the bad. And I think that's but that's where knowing yourself is important too. I think it's important. I've had some people ask me, one of the best questions I had someone ask me when I presented my master's thesis was someone who expressed that they had quit Instagram because it just was not good for them. And they were kind of asking me if I thought that they should be back on there for evangelization purposes. And I really thought about that for a while, but I want to clarify that I don't think everyone is called to use digital media to evangelize. I think this is maybe, if for some reason it was implied that it was an all statement, I don't think. I think it's a particular calling. I think that the dangers absolutely can outweigh the benefits for many people. I think you have to know yourself. I think you have to know your triggers. I mean, for example, if you're someone who is struggling with sexual temptation, and every time you go on Instagram, the algorithm knows that you looking at certain pictures, so it keeps showing you those certain pictures. Like, maybe it's time for you to delete Instagram. Like, you can justify it all you want is like, well, that's not pornographic itself, but if it's something that leads you to sin,
Yeah.
and your direct participation in it, then I mean, when we go to reconciliation, you commit not only to do penance and to sin no more, but also to avoid whatever leads us to sin.
Yes,
And I think that's an important thing. So I think we have to know ourselves, and it doesn't mean also that it's a black or white thing. I mean, like sometimes using the internet could lead someone to sin. It doesn't mean that they never should use the internet. So it's not always this black and white type situation, but I think there's a lot of discernment, and so I say that because I don't think that people who are Catholic who are online are all suddenly compelled to become, in a formal sense, digital, missionaries. But at the same time, there is another sense where we all are universally called to evangelize as Catholics, and to use, to spread the gospel using whatever virtuous means available to us. So kind of where the rubber meets the road is hard, but I say it to encourage some people, because I think that, for some people, maybe not being on social media is the better answer. Maybe you can actually love and serve your family and the church better by being completely absent from social media, right? But I also don't think Catholics should avoid it on principle. And the church has been quite clear about that in recent documents, that like there isn't a universal rejection of it as a means of communication technology is not permitted by the church either. But the church also doesn't tell you how to apply these types of things. It just says that you can't knowingly and fully reject it in a blanket kind of sense. So that's where the discernment process comes through. But hopefully that's just helpful. I just say that because I think sometimes there can be pressure in both ways, kind of pressure to use it, and then maybe pressure not to use it. And I think they can both be overdone.
Yeah. I don't tweet a lot anymore, more than I used to. My rule of thumb always was, though, I should be deleting at least 10 tweets for every one that I send. I think my friend, my good friend Matt Swaim was the one who kind of got that in my head to begin with. But it was right for me. That was perfect, right? Because I had a lot to say. Maybe one out of every 10 things I wanted to say actually was necessary to say. So I would delete. I'd get the, no, this is a deleter. I'm not posting that. But no, that was perfect for me though. Yeah, one out of every 10, and even those probably weren't really worth it. Noah, this has been an awesome discussion. Really fascinating. Thank you for sharing your journey. Thank you for sharing this stuff with us. It's so important, I think, just to stop and consider and think about. There's so much to mine in there, and I like that you give us lots of questions, some answers, but so many questions, kind of a framework to think through things. I think that's so valuable to actually begin to dig deeper versus just saying, hey, do this thing, and then you're done. It's just great. I love it. I can put links in the show notes to wherever you want me to put links to. Where do you want to point people towards? Because you do some awesome things. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Keith. This has been an absolute pleasure. I love talking about this stuff if it wasn't obvious. Thank you for wanting to talk about this and for having me on. So I guess I would just say, for anyone who wants to follow my work, I would encourage you to visit the McGrath Institute for Church Life page. It's mcgrath.nd.edu. There are lots of excellent resources, particularly catered towards Catholic leaders, but certainly not exclusively. So I would encourage you to check out the resources. If anyone out there is not Catholic but is inquiring, I would highly encourage you to join one of our discussion groups on crossthetibor.org. So as I mentioned earlier, that's a virtual community. It's also entirely free. And something that, we would love to plug you in with other people who are also inquiring, and plug you in with well-catechized Catholics who are eager and capable of answering your questions in a relational fashion, as we mentioned earlier. So, if you're a Catholic looking to dive deeper into your faith, definitely encourage you to go to mcgrath.nd.edu. If you're not a Catholic, curious about the faith and want to learn more from Catholics who are eager to share, crossthetibor.org.
That's fantastic stuff. Both awesome things, both fantastic stuff. Thanks for doing that. I want to say thank you, first of all, and God bless you and the work you're doing for the church. It's awesome. I've said fantastic already twice. I can't say it again, but maybe I should. It's great stuff. Everything you do is awesome. So thanks for doing
I
it.
like the word fantastic. I'm gonna probably start
Yeah.
saying it again. I like it. Yeah, it's gonna come in my rotation again. Yeah.
Oh well, thanks for being here. Yeah, really enjoyed it. So
It really
awesome.
was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Really, I was it was a great time.
Good. Awesome. Thanks so much.